Okay. But then if you don't understand results and it's a Friday afternoon.
You're being recorded, Tiffany.
Yeah. Huh?
You're being
Oh,
recorded.
sorry.
So the first week we did an introduction. I recognize that not everybody has been here for all three sessions. We did an introduction to what we're going to cover. There's a glossary from the first week that'll cover all the 3 weeks. In the middle over there with the handouts, there is a handout for what we're going to cover today. And then for anybody who did not get what Rabbi Helene went over in week 2, I've got a copy of that as well. And these sessions are all being recorded. They'll be on, Aubrey put the first and second session on YouTube, and they're live streaming on Zoom if you're ever wanting to attend one of the classes and can't make it. So what we're going to talk about today is we're going to put ourselves in the first century during Jesus's time and talk about the various Judaic sects that existed at the time. And like we talked about in the first session, the only thing that everybody agrees on in the Jewish world is the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Bible. There is not agreement on the rest of the books. We'll talk about why not everybody agreed on that, and why there was a schism. So the 4 groups that we're going to talk about, 2 of whom appear prominently in the New Testament, which are the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Essenes are not mentioned directly in the Bible, but they're an important group that we'll get to. And the Zealots are kind of peripherally mentioned. One of Jesus's 12 disciples was Simon the Zealot, and also Barabbas, who the crowd decided to free instead of Jesus at his crucifixion, is also thought to be a zealot. So we're going to talk about what was happening in Second Temple. Can anybody tell me what I mean? Oh, can anybody tell me what I mean by Second Temple?
Is the building of the second temple after the first temple was destroyed by Babylonians.
Yes, you're absolutely correct. So after Babylon conquered Judea, Assyria conquered the northern kingdom, Babylon conquered the southern kingdom, took almost everybody away and put them in various places through the Babylonian kingdom. So Solomon's temple was destroyed. Then when Persia came along and conquered Babylon, they said, hey, you can go rebuild your temple. And that's what became the second temple that existed in Jesus' times with some upgrades by King Herod. So the second temple was rebuilt around 516 BC and expanded by Herod the Great. Now, at the time we're talking about first century Common Era, which also Anno Domini for those of us who are used to the old way, was under Roman occupation. The Roman occupation followed the Hellenistic or Greek occupation. Now, the Hasmonean revolt, it is actually pretty key to what developed the schisms among the Jewish people. So when the Greeks were in charge, many Jewish people thought that their leadership was getting a little too cozy with the Greeks or the Hellenists, and that they were compromising their traditions. And it came to a head when Antiochus IV, who was after Alexander the Great, desecrated the Jewish temple, and the Jews revolted, and they won for a period of time. One of our chief sources outside of the Bible for the historicity of everything that's in the Bible and other things that we know is Josephus. Now, Josephus was a little bit after Jesus, but he was a Pharisee, and he was part of a revolt against Rome. And then he said, "Oh, no, not so fast. This isn't a good idea." And he made peace with Rome and wrote the most famous history during that time about the Jewish people, called the Jewish Wars. And also he wrote an entire history of the Jewish people. So the first group that we're going to talk about, and let me see if I can move this. The first group that we're going to talk about is the Pharisees, and that's the group we read about most often in the New Testament. And their name is from Perishim, meaning separated one. They emerged during the Hasmonean dynasty. The Hasmonean dynasty have you ever heard of the books of Maccabees? Okay, the Maccabees chronicle the Jewish revolt against these Greek leaders and set up the Hasmonean dynasty. And the Hasmonean dynasty solved a lot of problems because it put Jerusalem and Judea back under Jewish people, but not without some controversy that we'll learn about. Now, the Pharisees are very important because from them is what our contemporary rabbis came from. So we're talking about 4 groups. The only one that lasted was the Pharisees. Now, what did they believe in? Definitely the Torah was above everything else. For those of you who were here last week, you will have noticed that Rabbi Helene kept referring back to the Torah. And even when she was talking about the prophets, she said that in worship, they used the prophets in reference back to the Torah. So everybody agrees that Torah is the top. But here's where the problem lies with Jesus, is that they believed that their oral tradition was equally as authoritative. So all of the times when they said, "No, Jesus, you can't do that," it wasn't necessarily in the Torah, but it was in the oral tradition. Now, they believed that in resurrection, they believed in angels and spirits. They also believed in free will. And they believe God will reward the righteous and punish the wicked. And their emphasis was not so much the temple, They supported the temple, but they were the basically group leaders who were going out and teaching the common people, who of course could not read. And so they were the worship leaders, which is the precursor to the modern synagogues. They did expect a Messiah who would herald an era of world peace. As Rabbi Helene told us last week, all of the current Jewish sects still expect a Messiah to come. They just don't believe that Jesus was the Messiah. So they accepted the full Hebrew Bible that we accept today in Protestant land, just with a different number of books and a different order. But as I said, they believed that this oral tradition was also given to Moses at Mount Sinai. That's what gives it the authority. Then, so the Torah was the only thing that was written down of these two definitive things. So how do we, if it was an oral tradition, how do we even know about it? How did it survive? Well, it survived orally until about 200 CE or Anno Domini, when Rabbi Judah Nahasi or Hanasi, don't grade me on pronunciation. He codified it. Some controversy about that, but he said, I don't want this to get lost. I'm going to write it down. So the oral tradition became the Mishnah, and the Talmud also includes rabbinical commentaries on the Bible.
Emily,
Yes,
would the Dead Sea Scrolls reflect any of the oral tradition?
no,
Were they not captured there?
no.
Okay.
So the oral tradition and the rabbinical interpretations of the Torah gave them more flexibility because they could look at Jewish law and they said, well, this is what it really means. And it still gives them flexibility today. Like Rabbi Helene said, we didn't have electricity in the first century. And so now there are traditions about like whether you can turn on lights or not during the Sabbath. So the Sadducees and the Essenes, Carl, rejected the oral law. They said, no, that's not going to fly. Now, I put what the contemporary Jewish sects accept because I thought that was very interesting about the oral law. So the Orthodox believe, yes, it's like sacrosanct, and it's fully binding. It's equal to the Torah. So that's the modern Orthodox Jews. The conservative Jews say, yeah, the oral law, yeah, it's good and important, but it's not the same as the Torah. And we can adapt it. The Reform Jews believe that the oral law is not divine, and they're not bound by what says in it, what is said in it. And the Reconstructionist Jews, who are the most liberal of all, probably the Reformer Reconstructionists are probably some of the people who offered shellfish and ham to Rabbi Helene when she first came to St. George. So let's talk about the Sadducees. Now, the Sadducees were the high up aristocratic priestly class. And they were the ones who were most likely to align themselves with people in power, because all they cared about was control of the temple. And they took their lineage from Zadok. Now, Zadok is an important figure in first century. Now, everybody knows that Aaron was the first priest under Moses. Then when we had the 12 tribes, the tribe of Levi was identified as the priestly tribe. Now, when David came along, not all of the priests, there was, a lot of stuff going on. Not all of the priests stayed true to David. Zadok did. And Zadok also stayed true when the kingdom split into the northern and southern kingdom. And Solomon, which was as a result of what Solomon did, marrying 700 wives, as well as other things. Zadok then became the definitive lineage of the priestly class. So both the Pharisees and the Sadducees agreed that the Sadducees came through the line of Zadok. So that's why the Pharisees accepted them as the leaders of the temple.
Zadok is a person or
A
tribe?
person.
A person.
Mm-hmm.
Good.
Whoops. So they were also the leaders of the Sanhedrin. There were Pharisees that were part of the Sanhedrin, but the Sadducees are at the tippy top. We don't have any of their writings. We like independent writings, probably because they only accepted the Torah as authoritative. So what did they need to write for? But the other reason is because they were tied so closely to the temple that when the temple was destroyed in 70 CE, no more Sadducees. No more temple, no more Sadducees. But the Pharisees, they survived because they were out in the community establishing synagogues. And so they had a system that was independent of the temple. So because the Sadducees only accepted the Torah, there's nowhere in the Torah that it talks, the first 5 books, that it talks about resurrection after death. So they were like, okay, this is the life that we have after we die, nothing. And they were tied to the temple rituals, sacrifices, and the priestly authority. And in order to keep their authority, they were willing to compromise with whoever was in power, whether it was the Greeks or the Hasmoneans, which was the Jewish, the book of Maccabees chronicles when they rebelled against the Greek authority, and they held power for 150 years, where they divided the Jews was the fact that they claimed both kingship, which is supposed to be through David. They also claimed priestly authority. Can't do that. Can't be both. So who was okay with it? The Sadducees. They said, hey, leave us the temple. Let us run it. We're okay with it. We don't agree with you, but live and let live. The Pharisees did not agree with that because they were not following tradition. And so the Sadducees did not say that you could accept the oral tradition, just the strict Torah, which put them in direct conflict with both the Pharisees and Jesus. Now, the Essenes are a very interesting group. They're not anywhere in the Bible, but they said, you guys have all corrupted everything. You're all wrong. We don't want anything to do with you. We're going to go out in the desert and be pure. And we are the true heirs to Zadok. They rejected the Sadducees' claims. Pharisees accepted the Sadducees' claims that they were the heirs of Zadok. The Essenes said, no, we're our own thing. We're the only ones who are doing it correctly. And we are pure and holy, and everybody else is corrupt. They were, of course, the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Is there any writings by Zadok that we can obtain and read?
And I'm sure that there may be pseudepigraphal writings by Zadok, writings that claim to be of Zadok, but he's not one of the prophets in the Old Testament. And although since the Essenes claim that they are the true sons of Zadok, there may be something in their writings, but that would have been written like way after that, because the Essenes were prominent during like the 4th century before Common Era through the fall of the temple and Roman destruction of
So they were also
everything.
the keepers of the Dead Sea Scrolls too.
They
right?
were exactly.
I was just thinking about the writings of those, and those yet to be interpreted totally, but I don't know. I was just trying to put something together there.
No, there's no book of Zadok, but he is memorialized in Kings and Chronicles when it described the history of what happened with David and Solomon. So the Essenes, they're really big about ritual purity. And even to the fact that, like, if you had birth defect, no, you can't be an Essene. You have to be pure. They have a lot of baptismal areas. They like baptized every single day. So they interestingly, another thing they said that the Pharisees and Sadducees got wrong is that the holidays observed by them were on the lunar calendar. And the Essenes said, nope, we're the true sons of Zadok. It was supposed to be on the solar calendar. So they celebrated their holidays on different days. Now, unlike the Pharisees, they believed in predestination. So no free will. And I forgot to mention Pharisees. Josephus says there was probably about 6,000 of them. Essenes, he said there was about 4,000 of them. He doesn't anywhere say how many Sadducees there might have been, but I think it would have been a pretty small group. So what did the Essenes accept as canonical? They accepted the Torah and the prophets, and then they had a lot of their own writings. And those are in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And they had a lot of writings or these are the rules of our community. And they had a lot of apocalyptic texts. And of course, in their apocalyptic texts, the Essenes were the heroes. And out of them came the defeat of the Romans, and the Essenes won out over everybody, which of course didn't happen, and they died out. In the Dead Sea Scrolls is every portions of every Old Testament book except for Esther. And they showed a community with its own calendar, purity rites, and own messianic expectation. So during the first century, just to emphasize, there was no this is the Bible. There was not complete agreement. Different people had different ideas. The sect that survived, the Pharisees, they accepted the same thing that we accept in our Old Testament. And so that became the Bible. Old Testament for us. Now, who are the zealots? I talked about how one of Jesus's disciples was called Simon the Zealot. Now, the Pharisees, the Sadducees were in cahoots with the Romans. The Pharisees are we're not too happy about this, but we don't want to rock the boat too badly. The Essenes are the heck with all you guys, we're going in the desert. The Zealots were no, the Bible commands us to rise up in rebellion against the Romans. And so they were founded, it says here, by Judas of Galilee in 6 Anno Domini, or Common Era. Josephus refers to them in his writings as the fourth philosophy. Now, in terms of what they believed was biblical, no different than the Pharisees. They had the same scripture, but what they differed in is what they needed to do about Roman occupation, either accommodate it or rebel against it. And paying tribute to Rome was idolatry. So they would certainly not have agreed with render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. And some of their heroes, remember Elijah, who killed all the prophets of Baal? Big hero. Mattathias, who launched the Maccabean revolt, big hero. And Phinehas, who during the Exodus period killed an idolater. He was also a big hero. So, to summarize what the four sects were, socially, the Pharisees were our middle class. The Sadducees were the aristocrats. The Essenes were separatists. And the Zealots were kind of a mixed bunch in terms of where they derived. The Pharisees accepted the same thing that we do in the Old Testament, Torah, prophets, and writing, also the oral law. The Sadducees said, no, Torah only, just the first 5 books. the Essenes accepted the Torah, prophets, and their own materials. And the Zealots, the same as the Pharisees. The Pharisees did believe in resurrection. The Sadducees said, no way, it's not in the Torah. The Essenes believed in the immortality of the soul. So that might not be bodily resurrection, but immortality of the souls. Zealots, again, the same as Pharisees. What happens in the afterlife? And is there one? Pharisees believed that there was reward and punishment for your deeds. Sadducees, obviously, no. And Essenes and Zealots, yes. Angels and spirits, same thing. Relationship to Rome. Pharisees are like, okay, well, we're gonna accept that, which is part of why Jesus was so threatening to them, was because they thought he was there as a political leader to overthrow Rome, which is not what they wanted, because they thought we can't win. Let's concentrate on retaining our Jewish tradition in synagogues. Sadducees are like, yeah, whoever's in power, we'll play with them as long as they let us run the temple. Essenes said, no, everybody's wrong, and we'll go to the desert. Zealots are like, okay, we're going to fight. So the Pharisees did respect the temple. They did accept the Sadducees as the heirs of Zadok. But they were also out in the community, which the Sadducees most definitely were not out in the community. Nor were the Essenes, and the Zealots were focused on rebellion. So each of them rejected Jesus, but for different reasons. The Pharisees, Jesus challenged their traditions, particularly the healing on the Sabbath, eating with unwashed hands, declaring all foods clean. I mean, that contradicted not only the oral tradition, but the Torah as well. Carol, you're correct.
Emily,
Yes.
I don't think many of us can read that. Could we have a light so we can look at our papers?
Sure.
That a problem for the rest of you?
That's fine.
So Jesus also said, I've got the authority to forgive sin. What blasphemy! He associated with sinners. That's so impure. And tax collectors, yes. Lepers, ugh. And he was the wrong kind of Messiah. They expected a Messiah who was going to rise up and like everybody would follow their beliefs, the Torah and everything that they believed in, and usher in a period of spiritual awakening. So Jesus was a threat because he was quite popular with the common people and teaching things that they did not agree with. And they were also worried about the Romans' reaction. The Sadducees had all kinds of problems with Jesus. He taught, after all, that there was an afterlife, which they staunchly did not believe. He said that he cleansed the temple out. Said, hey, money changers, well, that's our source of revenue. We're the aristocrats. What the heck are you doing here? They also thought he would provoke Rome. And he actually said in Matthew something greater than the temple is here. How dare he? The temple is everything. It's the source of their power.
You see that in Europe a lot, all these magnificent churches that are built.
Mhm.
You know, they throw all this money in there and you walk in, they're empty. You know, okay,
You have to make room for the tourist car.
yeah, you're right, they're gonna keep them open.
New Jersey, too. Like the time.
Yes.
And when the Sadducees challenged Jesus about the resurrection, you may remember the story of them saying, okay, so a woman married a man, he dies, marries his brother, he dies.
No, I have.
And part of his response was he refers back to the Torah. And God said, I am. And that he refers to himself in the present tense with Abraham and others. So kind of a brilliant argument because he's arguing on their own terms. And the Essenes, obviously, they didn't agree with anything Jesus said.
Sorry, I have to do the nursery.
That's okay. But what's interesting is in their emphasis on community and communal meals, there were a great deal of similarities to them, how they behaved in the early Christian communities. Now, interestingly, they had a two Messiah expectation, a priestly Messiah and a royal Messiah. Of course, both of them were Essenes. Don't be fooled. So, I mean, love your enemies. The zealots, what? What do you mean, love your enemies? We've got to fight them. Render under Caesar, no way. Definitely the wrong kind of leader. The Messiah is going to help us overthrow Rome. So what's this about a spiritual kingdom? But some of the zealots were drawn to Christ, hence Simon the Zealot. Now, I talked a lot about Josephus. He lived from 37 to 100. He was originally a revolutionary. He was not a zealot, but he was a reluctant leader. But once it was obvious that Rome is not going to be defeated, he said, I surrender. And the history he wrote, the Jewish Wars and the history of Judaism, was written for the Romans. He wanted them to understand the Jews and that the Jews were not a threat and how important, get them to understand who they were so that they didn't persecute them. So he wrote the Jewish Wars and the Jewish Antiquities. He's the one where we've got the most, because he wasn't Christian. So what he wrote gives us, outside the Dead Sea Scrolls, the best extra biblical evidence for everything we read in the New Testament. Now, we talked about the Dead Sea Scrolls, and so far there's about 900 manuscripts dating from the 2nd century before Common Era to the 1st century after Common Era. Includes, as I said, everything, all the Old Testament books except Esther, They have the community rule, the war scroll, the temple scroll, their own temple, not the Sadducees, and the commentaries. They did have a lot of apocryphal and pseudepigraphal works. Somebody tell me what pseudepigraphal means. It's a Thanksgiving word. Pseudo means false, and pigraphal is writing. So it's writing that's attributed to biblical leaders that weren't really written by them. But let's give it some weight by saying it was written by them, shall we? So their canon, obviously, with all those writings, was completely fluid, had differences in calendars, purity laws, messianic expectations, and temple theology. And we're going to have another one of our classes going to be focusing specifically on Dead Sea Scrolls. So get excited now.
Yeah.
Okay, so the Mishnah and the Talmud, that's the oral tradition that I talked about. Mishnah was what was codified in 200 after Common Era, and it was compiled by Rabbi Judah Ha-Nasi. And it's divided into 6 sections: agriculture, festivals, family law, civil law, temple service, and ritual purity. So the oral tradition became even more important after the temple was destroyed. The Talmud, and Helene mentioned this a little bit last week, there were 2 versions. One is the Palestine or the Jerusalem Talmud. And there were still so many Jews that had been scattered into Babylon. And so the Babylonian Talmud also exists, which includes the Mishnah and their own commentary. So the Babylonian Talmud is just a lot bigger than the Jerusalem Talmud. But it does refer to the Zealots, the Sanhedrin, the Sadducee legal position. So that also lines up with what we know. So how these sources fit together, our New Testament in Gospel and Acts records, in the Gospels and Acts, records direct encounters with Pharisees, Sadducees, mentions the Zealots, and gives us our historical context. Josephus, he was doing it from a historical basis only, not theology. He was just recording these are the beliefs, this is the history. The Dead Sea Scroll, those are the oldest documents that are available to us. And what's amazing is how closely the wording in the Dead Sea Scrolls aligns with what we've inherited as the Old Testament. There are some differences, but they're pretty minor. Then the rabbinical tradition with the Mishnah and the Talmud also agree with what we know in the New Testament about these different groups. So the 4 sects held different views on what was scripture, except you would say the Zealots and the Pharisees really did agree. They each rejected Jesus for different reasons. Only the Pharisees survived and became our modern rabbis. Canon was not fixed in the Second Temple. So, and of course, it was all on scrolls. So it's not like anybody had a copy of the Old Testament. There was too much. It was handwritten on scrolls. It would be too expensive. Jesus, they all agreed Jesus wasn't it. He didn't meet anybody's expectations. And what's really cool is how much there is outside of the Bible that supports what the Bible says. So that is our class for today. Thank you for putting up with me.
It's not hard to put up.